An Introduction to the Black Death and the Reconquista, a podcast by Dr. Arpaio. First, let me explain the meaning of the two historical terms in the title. The Black Death was a highly contagious disease that made its appearance in Europe in the 14th century. The scientific term is the bubonic plague, a disease caused by bacilli or bacteria. It originated in Asia and was brought eastward by human migratory patterns. Evidence suggests that less contagious strains may have appeared in the West in ancient times, but certainly there was nothing like the virulent strain that swept across the Mediterranean basin and the European continent in the 14th century and caused a pandemic, a scientific term that means a disease that extends over a widespread area of the world. The bacteria that caused the plague developed an ingenious strategy for survival. Bacteria usually need an outside agency to travel from one host to another. The bacilli that caused the Black Death were carried by tiny insects called fleas. Fleas are human parasites, and flea bites were common until recent advances in hygiene made them rare. The bacteria that caused the plague did not attack fleas. Instead, the fleas were the bacilli's main means of locomotion. When a flea carrying the bacteria bit humans, it infected them with the plague-carrying bacilli. The bacteria then multiplied in human hosts, causing humans to come down with the plague as the bacilli waited for their chance to spread to other carriers and hosts. When fleas that did not carry the bacteria landed on an infected human to feed, their bites allowed the bacteria to piggyback in the human blood inside the flea. Fleas can travel on humans and other mammals, especially rats, which live in very close proximity to humans. When fleas carrying the bacteria bit humans who had not contracted the disease, the fleas infected the new human hosts. The human host could then pass the bacteria to other humans through the transfer of bodily fluids, turning humans into both hosts and additional agents for the spread of the bacteria. At the onset of the plague in the Mediterranean basin in Europe, the bacteria traveled with fleas, which in turn traveled on rats and humans. However, soon after arriving in the West, the bacteria mutated and became airborne, whereupon the pandemic spread much more rapidly through the human population. One challenge for the bacteria was to find a means of transmission in a few days' time, because a human would begin to suffer from the disease and either die, the more likely outcome, or fight off the infection, a less likely one. Travel by horse, a common form of human transportation in the Middle Ages, was ideal for the plague's survival strategy. A person who contracted the disease could travel by horseback over 100 miles before exhibiting the symptoms and succumbing to the disease. By that time, an infected human could come into contact with other hosts or carriers, thus increasing the likelihood that the bacteria could spread before anyone could avoid the host who showed recognizable signs of the disease. The Black Death first spread to the west by ship, to a few port cities, and then inland across the continent. It normally spread to an area, flared up, and then died down, after having wiped out most or all of the population. It often reappeared again, even decades after having first made an appearance in a given area. The plague remained a recurrent danger for the next 300 years in the West. In the 15th and 16th centuries, Europeans carried the plague to the New World along with other diseases, which killed off 90% of the indigenous human population within a very short time. This Great Dying, as the phenomenon was called, ensured that the Europeans would conquer the New World in short order. People died too rapidly during the 14th century to find reliable death records. so we do not know exactly how many people died. Estimates vary from 1/2 to 2/3 of local populations where outbreaks occurred. Historians estimate that overall about 50 million Europeans died in the pandemic. That's about 60% of the total population. We think of the Black Death as a medical emergency, and it was, though contemporaries viewed it as so much more than that. It is important to recognize this aspect of the pandemic in order to understand how the Black Death and the history of anti-Semitism intersected in 14th century Europe. The second historical term in the title is Reconquista, a Spanish word, so it is always italicized in English. The word should be capitalized too because it is a historical period. The literal translation in English is Reconquest, which really does not make sense. Instead, Reconquista is a shorthand for the Catholic conquest of the Iberian Peninsula and its unification under the monarchies of Spain and Portugal at the end of the 15th century. Since then, the Reconquista has also become a myth. However, the myth of the Reconquista oversimplifies a much more complicated history. We need to go back to the 8th century, when a Muslim army swept across North Africa, conquered most of the Iberian Peninsula, and established the Muslim kingdom of Al-Andalus. In the 9th and 10th centuries, Catholic kingdoms emerged in the north of the peninsula. From the 10th century to the 12th, these Catholic kingdoms expanded at the expense of the Muslim kingdoms to the south. In the 12th century, the Almohad, a group of North African Muslims, invaded Al-Andalus. The Almohad invasion of the 12th century weakened the Muslim kingdoms for reasons I will explain later. Let me just state here that the invasion enabled the Catholic kingdoms to continue their southward expansion. 3 Catholic kingdoms emerged as the primary protagonists of the Catholic conquest of the Iberian Peninsula. The 3 kingdoms were Portugal, Castile, or Castilla in Spanish, and Aragon, normally written with a forward slanting accent over the letter O. Portugal, Castile, and Aragon continued their drive southward in the 13th and 14th centuries until the Muslims only controlled a small area of the peninsula. By the end of the 15th century, the Reconquista was complete. Castile and Aragon merged into a single kingdom called Spain, while Portugal retained its independence as a separate Catholic kingdom. Now that we understand the terms the Black Death and the Reconquista, let's consider how developments in European anti-Semitism intersected with the arrival of the Black Death on the continent. It may seem like a cliché, but life was much harder for Europeans in the Middle Ages than it is today. Europeans were accustomed to death. Mortality rates were extremely high. More infants and children died than survived to adulthood, and the death of women in childbirth was an accepted part of life. As you might have already guessed, life expectancy was much lower than it is today. Most Europeans did not live past their 30s. Only a few lived into their 50s, and fewer still lived into their 60s. We would probably despair the medieval quality of life. Europeans had a poor diet based on a very different understanding of nutrition and the body. Compared to standards today in the developed West, medieval living conditions were quite unhealthy. The rural poor lived in huts of stone, wood, or mud with few or no windows to afford better protection against wolves and other predators. Families slept together on a single bed of straw, which afforded fleas a place to hide and to multiply. Farm animals slept indoors so rural families could keep them safe, but the farm animals also afforded fleas a place to hide. A hearth or fireplace served for cooking. Candles were expensive, so the poor went to bed at sundown and got up to work in the fields at sunup. There was no indoor plumbing anywhere for people of any social background, so the rural poor relieved themselves in buckets or outdoors. The urban poor lived in similar circumstances, but without the farm animals. If the head of a household were a master artisan or merchant, his or her shop was on the ground floor, and the family lived in the floor above. The urban poor normally lived and ate in a single room. The wealthier the family, the more likely the parents had sleeping quarters for themselves and separate rooms for the children. Renters, usually artisanal workers, servants, and the poor, live higher up in city buildings. Indeed, the higher up in a medieval urban structure, the poorer the living quarters. Urban dwellers used the same system as in rural areas for getting rid of human excrement. Chamber pots, as they came to be called, were unceremoniously dumped from windows onto the streets below. Separate sewage systems that remove waste from a city were rare before the 19th century. So, feces pooled in the streets and flowed into something akin to a storm sewer. Drains carried the dark water, as it was called, to the river that invariably flowed through every medieval European city. Otherwise, someone would have the unenviable task of manually collecting the sewage. Since urine was used for tanning hides, it had monetary value, and someone collected it on a regular basis. The wealthy generally preferred to live in the countryside. Rural areas reportedly had healthier living conditions compared to cities. In both rural and urban areas, the wealthy had the advantage of affording servants to do menial and unhealthy tasks. In medieval cities, the wealthy lived on what was considered the best floor, what we call the second floor in the United States, but what Europeans still call the first or noble floor. Wealthy families had a separate kitchen, separate bedrooms, and a common room for daytime activities. The wealthy also had better access to doctors, with Jewish physicians having the best reputation because of their greater knowledge of how the body worked and a better understanding about the treatment of patients with medicine. The wealthy also had the means to flee when epidemics broke out, as they invariably did in the close quarters of medieval cities. The wealthy's relatively healthier living conditions was one reason why they had a greater probability of surviving to old age than the poor did. That is, if they could survive childhood. However, that all changed with the Black Death. European medicine was based on what we know today to be erroneous assumptions about the human body. To make matters worse, Europeans did not have the vast arsenal of modern drugs to protect themselves. People died from afflictions that would not even trouble our mind today. For instance, the slightest wound could easily become infected. Of course, no one knew about antibiotics, so people used what we consider to be today natural or alternative medicines. Some probably worked to a certain extent, because natural medicines like herbs and substances like olive oil and garlic contain naturally occurring medicine and have antibiotic or antiseptic properties. Jews and Muslims ritually bathed as part of their religious practices, which theoretically gave them a health advantage over Christians who avoided regular washing because they thought water spread illness. It was not as crazy as you might think. Water sources, especially in cities, were often polluted, and sometimes with fecal matter, making the water dangerous to drink or to use in washing. Medieval Europeans learned to recognize the warning signs of disease, and such was the case for the Black Death. Doctors began to warn that a swelling of the lymph node glands in the armpits and groin, which then turned black, was a sure sign that someone had contracted the bubonic plague. These symptoms gave rise to the names given to the disease: the bubonic plague, from the Greek word for groin, and Black Death, from the color of the swollen lymph nodes. Unfortunately, no one knew how to stop the spread of the plague, let alone how to care successfully for patients. Thinking that bad odors caused the disease, which was how people explained the spread of malaria, another widespread disease, doctors on the Italian peninsula came up with an ingenious medical mask that kept the supposedly malevolent odors at bay. Small sponges soaked in perfume, urine, or vinegar filled the beak of the mask and covered the stench of patients. While they may have kept the doctor at a distance from the patient because of the long beak, they provided no real protection against the risk of contagion. European doctors came up with many remedies that, in retrospect, boggle the mind. They recommended avoiding so-called smelly foods like cheese, beef, pork, and lamb in favor of eating bread, fresh vegetables that grow above ground, and fruit. These foods were relatively scarce in the European diet at the best of times, especially for 90% of the population who were too poor to afford them. Some doctors prescribed a drink made from molasses, the ground roasted shells of newly laid hen eggs, marigold petals, and stout ale. A more complicated cure consisted of first softening the swollen lymph nodes in the underarms and groin by applying a mixture of chopped figs, onions cooked in butter, and yeast, followed by lancing the swollen lymph nodes. Another cure called for putting a live frog under the patient's armpit and on the groin, so that the belly of the frog came in contact with the sores. According to this remedy, if kept in place, the frog would absorb the so-called humors and burst, thus relieving the patient of the evil substances that supposedly caused the disease. Doctors recommended repeating this procedure with as many frogs as it took until they no longer burst, which was supposedly a sign that the patient was cured. Another remedy was to lance the boils and to cover the wound with a mixture of tree resin, white lily root, and dried human feces. Given that these medical remedies passed as the most advanced medicine of the day, it is no wonder that recovery was a matter of the toss of the die. 14th century Christians, Jews, and Muslims all believed that human tragedy is a sign of divine punishment. So, it's not surprising that they understood the Black Death as a sign of the God of Abraham's anger with them. Given the scope and extent of the plague, they became convinced that they were facing a moral crisis of unimaginable proportions. Another reason they arrived at this conclusion was how the Black Death killed people off with seeming disregard. It was just as likely to kill the very poor as the very rich, the powerful as the powerless, people in rural and urban areas, and, from all walks of life, the clergy, the nobility, and the commoners. Furthermore, people renowned for their piety were just as likely to die from the Black Death as people notorious for their wickedness. The Catholic clergy's lifestyle of living in close quarters, sheltering travelers, and caring for the sick facilitated the spread of the Black Death among them. Contemporary accounts relate that in many monasteries and convents, not a single monk or nun survived. Because Catholics considered their clergy closest to God, it seemed inexplicable that God would single them out for punishment. Worse still, as Catholics fell ill and died, no one was left to administer the sacraments, that is, rituals Catholics require for salvation. The gruesome nature of the plague captured the imagination of the people in the West. So many people were dying of the disease, and so quickly, that plague pits or mass graves were dug everywhere. Bishops consecrated whole rivers so that bodies could be dumped into them in order to satisfy the requirement that Catholics be buried in a consecrated space. Of course, dumping plague victims in the river only increased the likelihood that the Black Death would spread, as floating rotten cadavers worked their way downstream to the surrounding countryside and to other cities. Not everyone died of the plague. Some survived, while others never contracted the disease at all, thus confounding the greatest medical minds of the age. Even more puzzling was how some people who had not contracted the disease, or had survived as it passed through their area the first time, got ill and died the second or third time the plague reappeared. The best remedy against the Black Death was flight. Of course, one had to have the means to flee, which was not easy if one were poor, a serf, or an apprentice, or if one had a family or other social obligations. People also began to notice that coming into contact with a sick person made one more likely to fall ill. Thus, Europeans associated the appearance of the Black Death with outsiders. Since Jews were both outsiders and supposedly in league with Satan in the medieval Catholic Weltanschauung, Europeans were more likely to blame the Jews for the plague than anyone else. They accused Jews of poisoning wells with vile concoctions of things like frogs, spiders, lizards, consecrated hosts, and even the ground-up hearts of Christians. They arrested Jews and tortured them into confessing, thus confirming Catholic prejudices. Catholics loudly demanded the extermination of European Jews, and many Jews were burned alive, together with their homes and property. These attacks killed the fleas that contributed to the pandemic, so the burning of Jews in their homes was seen as having proven results, at least in the short term. As the pandemic spread, the 14th century phenomenon of Catholic flagellants appeared. These flagellants, normally men, banded together for 33 days. They confessed their sins to a priest and beat themselves daily until they bled. They vowed not to bathe, to shave, to sleep in a bed, to change clothes, or to have sex. They traveled from town to town, beating themselves in the marketplace and calling upon townsfolk to repent. Many Catholics gave credence to the flagellants, thinking that because the flagellants denied themselves creature comforts for the remission of sins, the flagellants were the holiest and closest people to God. They listened to flagellants who urged them to do their Christian duty and purge Europe of its Jews. Some Catholics even assumed the blood of flagellants was powerful enough to perform miracles. As the flagellants whipped themselves publicly in the town square, people would soak up the flagellants' blood, thinking it would cure them of the Black Death or prevent it from spreading to their homes. As the flagellants attracted large followings, and as Catholics began to look up to them over traditional elites, many Catholic clergy, monarchs, and city leaders grew alarmed over the flagellants as a threat to their authority. Popes and European monarchs had long recognized the value of Jewish doctors and had employed them as their personal physicians. Pope Clement VII reasoned that since Jews too were dying from the plague in huge numbers, they could not be responsible for the Black Death. But the general hysteria was too great, and the people's respect for the flagellants too high for the Pope's logic to have the desirable effect. Elites saw the flagellants as a threat to society. They had welcomed the Jews in their midst for economic and financial reasons. Now, the flagellants threatened to undermine their kingdom's well-being by calling for the extermination or expulsion of European Jews. Municipal leaders stopped the flagellants from entering the city gates. Flagellants brought chaos with them. They disrupted the collection of taxes, and they incited burghers to set fire to Jewish neighborhoods, thus jeopardizing the rest of the city. Eventually, this elite opposition to the flagellants, as well as the waning of the pandemic at the end of the 14th century, brought the phenomenon of the flagellants to an end. but the human cost to the Jews had been significant. While historians are unsure of the number of Jews murdered by Christians during Europe's first encounter with the Black Death, they have arrived at a reliable count of 60 large communities wiped out and another 150 smaller ones annihilated over the 14th century. The violence we find against Jews in Europe contrasts starkly with the treatment of Jews in Muslim society. Whereas the rate of contagion for both Catholic and Muslim areas is about the same, Muslims did not single out the Jews for blame, nor did they accuse Christians of spreading the plague. Neither did Christians and Jews blame each other. Instead, Muslim leaders asked Jews and Christians to join them in fasting and praying for deliverance from what they all believe was a divine punishment from the same one God. The principal reasons for this different treatment of Jews is important for our history of anti-Semitism. Muslims believe that Jews and Christians belong to Muslim society. Muslims also believe that the God of Abraham commanded them to protect law-abiding Jews and Christians. Furthermore, Jews and Christians were an integral part of Muslim society, and Muslims believe they contributed to its general welfare. Thus, in the 14th century, Muslims generally saw Jews and Christians as part of the solution to stopping the Black Death, not as a cause of it. In stark contrast, Catholic societies in Europe held that their God commanded them to live in single-faith communities, so Jews and Muslims did not belong. Indeed, Catholics believe that the same one God commanded them to persecute Jews, because the Jews were guilty of deicide for having killed Jesus, and because they were now out to destroy Catholic civilization by spreading the plague. Furthermore, although some members of the Catholic elite had granted Jews the privilege of living and working in Europe, the rest of society had not accepted them. Most European Catholics saw the Jews as outsiders. Thus, Catholics saw the Jews as a problem. They were one of the principal causes for the plague. We can conclude that because Muslims had accepted the Jews since the founding of Islam, the notion that the Jews caused the plague never gained traction. By contrast, because Christians had developed a deep-seated hatred towards Jews from the 4th century onward, the resulting anti-Semitic worldview made it more likely that European Catholics would blame the Jews for the Black Death. The experience of the plague in Europe added a new dimension to European anti-Semitism. The Jewish threat became universal and constant in the anti-Semitic worldview that emerged during the 14th century. All Jews, men, women, and children, constituted an existential threat to all Catholics. This new threat was ubiquitous. It could be found everywhere Jews were found in Europe. Moreover, because of how the Black Death spread through the human population, Jews in one area constituted a threat to Christians everywhere. So, now it was in the interest of Catholics to eliminate the Jews. For the first time, anti-Semitism acquired an exterminationist quality. The exterminationism of the 14th century was much more widespread than what one finds during the Crusades, when exterminationist attitudes were limited by social background and by geographical location. Exterminationism is a term we historians use to differentiate between calling for the death of a particular group of Jews and calling for the extermination of all Jews in a society. The recurrence of the plague over the next 300 years ensured that exterminationist elements in European anti-Semitism endured long after the pandemic of the 14th century disappeared. Images in churches and other public buildings, illustrated manuscripts, and oral accounts all justified and celebrated the destruction of European Jews, and served as constant reminders of both the old and new threats that Judaism posed to Catholics in the European mind. They became a constant reminder for a call to arms against the Jews and drew on both the most recent and older forms of anti-Semitism. Even into the 17th century, violence against Jews could flare up any time the plague returned. It's no wonder that Jews began to flee Western Europe in search of refuge. Many settled further eastward in Europe, where rulers in the Netherlands, Poland, and Russia were still eager to take advantage of Jewish contributions to their societies. Other Jews returned to Muslim rule under the Ottoman Empire, where they had Muslim protection as a tolerated minority. In these four areas they found safety, at least for the time being. We need to consider a final point about the intersection of the Black Death and anti-Semitism before moving to a consideration of the Reconquista. Historians argue that anti-Semitic violence in the 14th century was inspired in part by economic motives. These historians argue that Europeans attacked Jews because they were in debt to Jewish moneylenders or because they believed that the Jews threatened their livelihood. According to this theory, religion could not have been a motive, because the highest political religious authorities in Europe publicly condemned the attacks. However, one can offer an alternative theory that may better explain the motivations for the violence. According to this alternative theory, economics may have been a factor, but the driving motive was still religious. It's just that the religious motivation came from a different source than from the elites during the plague. So, let's consider the evidence in support of this alternative theory. Most of the perpetrators of the violence against the Jews during the plague came from the subordinate classes and included religious from the lower ranks of the clergy. The political religious authorities who disavowed the violence came instead from the elites. The elites couched their condemnation in a language aimed at fellow elites rather than at the subordinate classes who perpetuated the violence. I mean this in both a literal and figurative sense. They wrote and spoke in Latin, the official language of the religious and non-religious European elites. They wrote and spoke in metaphors, drew on theological debates, and used legal arguments that were all lost on the subordinate classes, who were, after all, both illiterate and uneducated. Additionally, their condemnations came after the violence had happened, and condemnations are by nature reactive, not proactive. Thus, the elites could not have motivated the people who carried out the violence one way or the other. Another important piece of evidence is that even though the elites condemned the violence, neither popes, nor emperors, nor bishops repudiated the religious anti-Semitism that served as a motive force in the medieval worldview. Now, by motive force, I mean a primary driving force that motivates people to act. By contrast, authority figures who endorsed and incited the violence came from the subordinate classes. They spoke the people's language, again, literally and figuratively. When they drew on official religious positions on the Jews, they interpreted them in ways that made sense to the subordinate classes, but may not have been considered legitimate to the religious elite. These men were popular authorities. By the term popular, I mean of the people or of the subordinate classes. This term serves to define something or someone as belonging more to the subordinate classes than to the elite classes. Indeed, these popular authority figures were not recognized by medieval elites as having any legitimacy or authority to speak for the Catholic God. Be that as it may, scholars today make the mistake of not recognizing that medieval subordinate classes did consider these popular figures as legitimate religious authorities. They ignored or disobeyed the elites and followed these popular political religious figures in attacking the Jews. Thus, we can conclude that, whereas the subordinate classes' motives may have included economics, their motives remain primarily religious. It's just that the religious motives originated from a different source from the traditional elites, namely from popular, political religious authorities whom the elite classes did not recognize as legitimate. This relatively new phenomenon points to a growing rivalry between elite and popular political religious leaders over the question of the Jewish presence in Europe. The rivalry dated back to the 9th century, when religious and political elites first invited Jewish families to settle in Europe. The elites granted privileges to Jewish communities to live and work in specific cities or towns. They were not motivated by benevolence towards the Jews. Instead, they saw Jews as beneficial to society and to their own political and economic fortunes. This contribution justified altering what would have been otherwise a homogeneous Catholic society. If this line of thinking did not win over all of the elites, it certainly did not win over the subordinate classes. Indeed, the greatest hostility invariably came from the subordinate classes who viewed the growing Jewish presence with alarm. The popular challenge to traditional elites over the Jewish question intensified during the First and Second Crusades. This was a crucial period for Catholic Europe that would endure in European collective memories. During the First Crusade, Christian armies conquered the Holy Land and established crusader states in what we call the Middle East today. Soon afterwards, Muslim forces began to recapture the cities they had lost. Catholic forces in France and the Holy Roman Empire mounted a second crusade, which ultimately failed. Under the leadership of Saladin, the Muslims then recaptured additional crusader kingdoms, including Jerusalem, in 1187. If human history were the will of the one God, as all Abrahamic religions professed, either God preferred Islam, which is what Muslims thought, or the Catholics had done something to displease God and were being punished for it, which is what Catholics thought. One possibility was that God was angry with Catholics over the presence of Jews in Catholic society. The Catholic elite and subordinate classes disagreed over how the Jews fit in. All Christians saw Jews as their eternal enemies. Popular figures like Peter the Hermit and Count Emicchio incited anti-Semitic violence and justified it with religious anti-Semitism during the Crusades. Elites could not and did not contradict the anti-Semitic Catholic worldview. Instead, traditional authority figures like the Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor, local bishops, and saintly men such as Bernard of Clairvaux and Peter the Venerable condemned popular violence, primarily out of a sense of their own self-interest. They wanted to retain a Jewish presence in Europe because they found it beneficial. So they appealed to the subordinate class's obedience to a social order that was supposedly sanctioned by God. If that appeal did not work, they relied on brute force to end popular violence towards Jews. There was a strong element of hypocrisy in the elite stance on the Jews during the early Crusades. When Crusader armies led by political religious elites captured Jerusalem in 1099, they carried out a massacre of Jews and Muslims in the city. Thus, the previous rebukes of the Pope, the Emperor, and other traditional leaders must have sounded hollow indeed. The rivalry between popular and elite elements in society over the Jewish presence deepened during the Black Death. Given the cataclysmic nature of the plague, European Catholics could easily believe that their God was angry with them because of the presence of Jews in Catholic society. Popular figures like the Flagellants stoked anti-Semitism. They appealed to the authority of the Catholic Church's millennial teachings on anti-Semitism. They invoked the supposed betrayal of Jews during the Crusades, and they counted on the chaos created by the plague and the righteousness of their cause to convince the subordinate classes that the Jews had to go. Elite political religious leaders again defended their own self-interests by counting on the subordinate classes' obedience to the social and political order and by relying on brute force. In the contest between elite and popular leadership, the Jews paid a terrible price. The next round in this rivalry occurred during the Reconquista. This time the elites threw in the towel and joined with popular forces because it served the interests of both a newly created Spanish crown and Spanish religious authority. Indeed, one can argue that the Reconquista was not so much a narrative of how Iberian Catholics won back control of the peninsula for a Catholic God, as a history of how the elite and subordinate classes unified their stance towards the Jews. They did so for the sake of a Spain and Portugal in which Jews and Muslims no longer had a place, and in which converts from Judaism and Islam would remain forever suspect. Because the topic of our course is a history of anti-Semitism, I will not follow the parallel threads of Jews and Muslims during the Reconquista. Rather, I will focus solely on the Jewish thread and anti-Semitism. The Muslim conquest of the Iberian Peninsula transformed the lives of Catholics and Jews, but it impacted each group differently, even though both groups became dhimmi, or tolerated minorities, under Muslim rule. For Jews who had been persecuted under Catholics, the Muslim conquest meant an elevation of their status. Catholics who had previously been in control, the conquest meant a decline. They were now required to respect Muslim laws and customs. They had to defer to Muslims. They had to pay the special taxes levied on the dhimmi, and they had to show respect for Jews. Eventually, Catholic collective memory could no longer remember a time before Muslims when Catholics had been in control of society. But the Catholic states to the north offered examples of how life could change for the better for them if they united and overthrew Muslim rule. This sentiment drove Catholic support for what became known as the Reconquista. It may seem difficult to comprehend today, but both Catholics and Jews thrived under Muslim rule. Many who buy into the myth of the Reconquista today do not want to accept incontrovertible historical evidence. But we've already learned that those who espouse myths are only convinced by hearing themselves and others repeat the same half-truths and outright lies. Such is the nature of myth and the difference between myth and history. The situation for Muslims, Catholics, and Jews on the Iberian Peninsula changed radically with the Almohad invasion. The Almohad victory upset the peaceful coexistence among the three Abrahamic religions. The Almohad forced Catholics and Jews to convert to Islam, which most other Muslims believed violated divine law. So, Catholics and Jews were left with few alternatives. They could flee before the Almohad army arrived, they could convert under pain of death, or they could pretend to convert and practice Catholicism or Judaism in secret. If discovered, however, the punishment was death. Although the Almohad were Muslim, they espoused a different form of Islam from Iberian Muslims. The Almohad persecuted the local Muslim population because they believed that the local Muslims were not practicing Islam correctly. Many Muslim elites joined Catholics and Jews in fleeing the Almohad. The Almohad thus made enemies among Muslims, Catholics, and Jews. Scholars argue that the dissension and strife caused by Almohad intolerance was one of the principal reasons for the decline of Muslim power on the Iberian Peninsula from the 12th century onwards. The Almohad invasion provoked a strong reaction in the Catholic kingdoms to the north. Catholic political religious leaders became more benevolent towards both Muslim and Jews. This treatment owed to a realization among Catholics that they too were imperiled by the Almohad. It was a case of the enemies of my enemies are my friends. Over the next 200 years, several Catholic monarchs in the north invited Jews and Muslims to serve in their state bureaucracies and armies. Later, as Catholic rulers fought against the Almohad, Jews and Muslims could be found fighting alongside Catholics. This historical fact of a Muslim and Jewish contribution to the Reconquista is omitted by the mythmakers. Catholic benevolence towards Jews and Muslims did not last. Later monarchs changed their stance as the Catholic monarchs began to conquer the Muslim areas to the south. Moreover, the benevolence of the political elites was not echoed by the majority of the Catholic clergy or the subordinate classes. One Iberian monarch, who distinguished himself in the manner in which he facilitated Jewish and Muslim participation in the civic life of his kingdom, was the 13th century King Ferdinand III of Castile. Ferdinand was born around 1201 and reigned from 1217 until 1231. In the 17th century, the Catholic Church made him a saint because Spanish elites saw his struggle against the Almohad as part of the Reconquista, despite Ferdinand III's benevolent attitude towards Jews and Muslims, which was conveniently forgotten. Ferdinand III included both Jews and Muslims in his royal administration and army because he needed their expertise against the Almohad threat. Thanks to a great extent of the king's benevolence towards Jews and Muslims, Castile was victorious over the Almohad, and the kingdom's reputation increased among the Catholic powers on the Iberian Peninsula, until it rivaled the power and prestige of the kingdoms of Aragon and Portugal. As elsewhere in Catholic Europe, neither the Catholic clergy nor Ferdinand III's other subjects looked kindly on his attitude towards Jews and Muslims. Catholics among the elites and the subordinate classes increasingly became jealous of Jewish and Muslim social advancement, believing that immigrants undermined their social, political, and economic status. During the Reconquista of the 14th and 15th centuries, the situation on the Iberian Peninsula differed greatly from the 13th century. The Castilian monarchy no longer followed benevolent practices towards non-Catholics. Royal policy put pressure on Jews and Muslims to convert, and a similar process occurred in the kingdoms of Aragon and Portugal. A broad consensus in public opinion increased the pressure on Jews and Muslims to convert to Catholicism. Since benevolence depended ultimately on the whim of a monarch, over time Jews and Muslims on the Iberian Peninsula found themselves in the typical liminal space one finds elsewhere in Catholic Europe. Wealthy Jews were treated as serfs of the exchequer, forced to lend money to Catholic monarchs without the privilege of owning their wealth outright. The Dominicans and the Franciscans, two Catholic religious groups, contributed to the increasing hostility towards Jews and Muslims, as well as to converts from the two religions and their descendants. The two Catholic orders were founded at the beginning of the 13th century. Franciscans were founded as an order of preachers, the Dominicans as a teaching order, with the additional task of rooting out heretics. Heretics are people whose religious beliefs are unacceptable to religious authorities who do not share their views. Both the Dominicans and Franciscans differed from the priests who ran Catholic parishes in three primary ways. First, they took a special vow of poverty in addition to the vows of chastity and obedience that all Catholic clergy increasingly took. This special vow of poverty made them appear closer to God than other clergy. Second, they owed their obedience to the Pope in Rome, and not to the local bishop like a parish priest did. This second aspect gave both orders a great deal of independence from local religious and political authority. Dominicans and Franciscans on the Iberian Peninsula enjoyed an independence from the papacy thanks also to the distance between the city of Rome and the Iberian Peninsula. Additionally, the papacy was weakened by a European struggle over its political and religious authority in the 14th and 15th centuries. Third, Dominicans and Franciscans were a special type of clergy called friars, clergy who traveled extensively around Catholic Europe, preaching and teaching as they went. Both religious orders were virulently anti-Semitic. They espoused an extreme form of religious anti-Semitism that drew on the teachings of John Chrysostom and Augustine. They spread myths about Jews, like the ones we have already studied, and vouched for their authenticity. The Dominicans propagated anti-Semitism among the elites by founding and taking over universities where the elites increasingly sent their sons to be educated. The Franciscans indoctrinated the majority of illiterate Europeans through their itinerant preaching and by directing townsfolk to act in religious theatrical performances, including passion plays, in which the actors depicted theatrically the myth of Jesus' death. Some historians even credit the Franciscans with laying the foundation of Western theater through these anti-Semitic plays. Dominicans and Franciscans were responsible for an increase in anti-Semitic violence on the Iberian Peninsula from the 13th to the 15th century. One example was Ferran Martínez, a 14th century Franciscan from Castile who was responsible for a massacre of thousands of Jews in 1391. Martínez came from Seville, a city of great significance for a history of anti-Semitism. By the end of the 14th century, it was home to the largest and most important Jewish community on the Iberian Peninsula. It was located in the south of the Kingdom of Castile, about equidistance between the Catholic Kingdom of Portugal and the Muslim Kingdom of Granada. From his early public life, Martínez gained a reputation as a fierce critic of the benevolent royal policy towards Jews. Because of his popularity and reputation as a Franciscan, the Archbishop of Seville appointed Martínez as a city magistrate, or judge. Martínez used his position to persecute Jews and to instigate violence against them. His persecution of Jews became so onerous that the city's Jewish community appealed to King Henry II of Castile to intervene. He ordered that Martínez stand trial because, like other European monarchs who granted privileges to Jews, Henry II believed the Jews of Seville were his Jews. The royal court found Martínez guilty of disobeying the king. He was forced to resign his judicial appointment, and the court commanded Martínez to stop meddling in the affairs of the king's Jews. Fresh from the victory over Martínez, Henry II ordered his royal officials elsewhere in the kingdom to honor the privileges that he and his predecessors had granted to Castilian Jews. Martínez resigned his municipal position, but he refused to obey the king's other demands, claiming that only the Pope had authority over him. Before the matter could be resolved any further, Henry II died and was succeeded by his son, Juan I. Martínez continued to use his influence to persecute Jews, so the city's Jews filed another complaint. King Juan ordered Martínez to stand trial a second time. Three principal issues drove the decisions of both monarchs. First, the crown was competing against Portugal and Aragon and waging a war against the Muslim kingdom of Granada. The crown viewed the Jews as a benefit in these efforts. Second, the crown correctly saw Martínez's anti-Semitic activities and his opposition to royal authority as a direct threat to public order. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Martinez's open disobedience to Henry II and Juan I constituted a direct challenge to royal authority. If Martinez could get away with disobeying the crown, the king was no longer sovereign in his own kingdom. In his second trial, Martinez defended the righteousness of his disobedience and his record as judge. He pointed out that his anti-Semitic actions and views were consonant with the official teachings of the Roman Catholic Church. The argument implied that the privileges Juan I and his predecessors had granted to Jews were not. It was a shrewd argument because the Castilian crown counted on the Catholic Church's support in its competition for supremacy with Portugal and Aragon. Martinez also argued that fidelity to the teachings of the Catholic Church was critically important, especially because most of the Iberian Peninsula had recently been under Muslim control. Under Muslim rule, Catholics had wrongly accepted Jews as co-equals. That had to change. The second argument was clever too, because it implied that the Castilian monarchy was not Catholic enough to justify it in its competition for leadership with the rival crown of Aragon. Martinez lost the second trial, and since he had offered a religious defense of his actions, Juan ordered a theological investigation into the friars' views. The stakes were higher now because, if found guilty of heresy, the punishment could be death. The magistrates for the religious court were all appointees of the crown, so the king could count on their siding with him despite the overwhelming support Martinez enjoyed among the local clergy and the non-clerical population. Given that the judges had all been chosen by the crown, it is perhaps not surprising that Martinez was found guilty again. Since he was too popular in Seville to put to death, the religious court banned him from accepting any official position in the Catholic Church under pain of excommunication. Not too long after the third trial ended, the king and the Archbishop of Seville died in quick succession. Juan was replaced by his son, Henry III, and the priests in the diocese set about electing a new archbishop. Henry was still only a child, so the crown found itself in a weaker position than if an adult had acceded to the throne. Martinez suddenly found his position strengthened. Henry III's mother, Queen Eleanor, was the daughter of the King of Aragon. She had wed Henry III's father in an attempt to bring peace between the two rival monarchies. Eleanor was a determined anti-Semite. As Queen Mother, she now gained an enormous influence over the crown while Henry was still a child. She had not agreed with her husband's prosecution of Martinez, and now she was in a greater position to support the Franciscan friar. Buoyed by the support of the Queen Mother for Martinez, the majority of anti-Semitic clergy in Seville chose him as their new archbishop. In one of his first official acts, Martinez ordered all Jewish synagogues in the city destroyed and that all religious texts be burned. As elsewhere in Europe, the destruction of Jewish religious texts resulted in the burning of all texts in Hebrew, since few Catholics could read Hebrew. By burning every text in the Hebrew language, diligent officials were certain that no religious texts escaped the flames. The city's synagogues and their contents were put to the torch. Only a few were spared when officials put loyalty to the crown over obedience to the archbishop. The Jews once again appealed to the Castilian crown over Martinez's latest actions against them. The king's advisers overcame the objections of the Queen Mother and removed Martinez from his post. They forced the Diocese of Seville to rebuild the synagogues that had been destroyed, and they ordered the diocese to pay restitution to the Jews. Refusing to give up, Martinez rallied his supporters, arguing that the crown had no right to tell the Catholic Church what to do, and insinuating that it was violating Catholic teaching. he instigated an uprising aimed at the Jews of Seville in the name of religion. He rationalized the revolt as a reaction against the king's advisors, and not the king, who was only a child and thus not in charge. The uprising later became known as the Great Massacre of 1391. It was an extraordinarily violent event in which Martinez's supporters lynched around 4,000 Jews. Those who escaped death were forced to convert to Catholicism. Martinez called on his supporters in the kingdoms of Aragon and Majorca to carry out additional massacres. They responded by killing thousands more Jews. Henry III and his advisors were outraged over the incident, and his advisors ordered the arrest of Martinez for his part in instigating the massacres. But public opinion eventually forced the crown to release the Franciscan. Although Martinez lost his battle with the crown, later monarchs in Castile, Aragon, and Portugal would adopt anti-Semitic policies more in line with the views of Martinez and his supporters. They found it necessary if they wanted to find popular support for their efforts to unify their respective countries. So the monarchies of Castile, Aragon, and Portugal increasingly pressured Jews to convert. Jews were forced to attend weekly sermons on Sundays. The monarchies rescinded privileges granted to Jews or declined to renew charters when they expired. They forced Jews to loan the state money without any intention of repaying them. These so-called forced loans were nothing more than legal blackmail and theft. The Kingdom of Castile, Aragon, and Portugal also enacted new anti-Semitic laws. Laws segregated Jews and Catholics. The possession of Jewish religious texts was banned, and many Hebrew texts were burned. And the kinds of professions open to Jews were limited. The importance of this moment in the history of anti-Semitism cannot be underestimated. The Iberian monarchies adopted a state-sponsored anti-Semitism in concert with popular anti-Semitism. This change gained for the crown crucial popular support from the subordinate classes. The unity of elite and popular forms of anti-Semitism under state sponsorship encouraged more intense forms of anti-Semitism and made them systemic. In other words, anti-Semitism became even more pervasive, persistent, and inescapable on the Iberian Peninsula under the two Catholic monarchies of Spain and Portugal. A reflection of the systemic nature of anti-Semitism can be seen in the Spanish and Portuguese adoption of new terms to describe Jewish converts and the descendants of Jewish converts. At first, Catholics in Castile and Aragon coined terms to identify Jewish converts and to distinguish between suspected motives for conversion. These terms were later adopted by Portuguese Catholics. Those who came from Catholics that had been Catholic for as long as collective memory could recall assigned the term New Christians to Jews who supposedly converted of their own volition. In other words, their motives were pure. By contrast, Jews who had purportedly been forced to convert or acted out of expediency were called conversos. Notice that the word conversos is italicized because it is a Spanish word used in English. And by the way, the singular for the term is converso, and although substantives in Spanish can have different masculine and feminine endings, in English one does not follow this rule. There can be no doubt that the two terms were used in a pejorative sense from the manner in which they included assumptions about the intentions of the converts that only the converts could know. Gradually, the term New Christian fell into disuse, while the term conversos was extended to all Jewish converts. The term conversos was then extended further to include the descendants of Jewish converts, even over many generations. The term conversos became an accepted marker of difference that spelled trouble for the former Jews and their descendants. Initially, the term was a social and cultural marker of difference, but it acquired a legal and political significance over time. At first, conversos enjoyed the same rights as other Catholics because conversion removed the religious impediment that prevented some Jews from entering the leading professions. These professions were generally in law, the church, and the state, and required a sophisticated cultural background that many Jewish families had acquired under Muslim rule. As conversos moved into the leading professions that their Jewish ancestors had been prevented from entering, their social advancement caused a backlash among Iberian Catholics who lacked the same cultural traditions. Other Catholics could no longer count on the law to protect the leading professions for themselves. This dynamic led them to search for ways to block the social advancement of conversos. Catholics who were not conversos came up with a new strategy. They claimed that conversos' blood was impure because the conversion to Catholicism could not change the supposed Jewish blood of converts. This argument conveniently meant that conversos were neither real Catholics nor real Spaniards at the point in history when the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon fused to become the newly created Kingdom of Spain. Of course, there's no such thing as Jewish or Spanish blood, but that did not matter to those who erroneously believed that blood was the substance that made you who you were. The acceptance of the notion that there was something in the blood that made conversos different from Spaniards was significant. It allowed one's identity as a converso to become both a political and cultural marker of difference, as the term found its way into the legal structure of the newly created Spanish state. Those who had been jealous of conversos had invented a new way to make converted Jews and their descendants permanent outsiders. Despite conversion, former Jews and their Catholic descendants became the other. It did not matter that this view contradicted Catholic teaching, whereby all Catholics are considered Catholic, whether converts or not. Nor did it matter that the view contradicted how Christians understood their own history. You will recall that Christians taught that their religion emerged as the early followers of Jesus, separated from Jews by their conversion to Christianity through baptism and a profession of faith in Jesus as the Jewish Messiah. If 14th and 15th century Spaniards were correct that Jews and their descendants were never real Catholics despite their baptism, then, logically, how were Jesus and his followers Christians, as the Roman Catholic Church claimed? The whole notion of conversos contradicted the very foundations of the Catholic faith. The papacy unequivocally condemned this way of thinking. Pope Nicholas V denounced the view that baptism did not make one equally Catholic as being contrary to the Christian dogma that baptism makes everyone equal in the sight of God. Spanish Catholics refused to accept the Pope's argument and simply disregarded it. Because Spain was on the periphery of papal power, and because the papacy had its own problems, the papacy found it impossible to impose its authority over Catholic Spain. When Nicholas V died shortly after his condemnation, his successor let the matter lie. State-sponsored anti-Semitism on the Iberian Peninsula only got worse when King Ferdinand of Aragon and Queen Isabella of Castile got married in 1469 and established the Kingdom of Spain. Ferdinand and Isabella were eager to use religion to unify their kingdom behind the newly created Spanish monarchy. They were even awarded the title of Most Catholic Monarchs by Pope Alexander VI. Better known today as the Borgia Pope, Alexander VI was of Iberian origin and granted the title because he was eager to support the new Spanish monarchy, and to earn its support for his political ventures on the Italian peninsula. A central element in the anti-Semitism of Ferdinand and Isabella was the Spanish Inquisition, a hybrid political and religious court that investigated allegations of heresy in Spain. These investigations included trials of conversos who were accused of secretly remaining Jews and only pretending to practice Catholicism. The new Spanish state ran the Inquisition, while the Dominicans provided theological expertise as judges called inquisitors. The first two leaders of the Inquisition, called Grand Inquisitors, were also Dominicans. Spaniards had economic incentives for making accusations, since they were given a percentage of the guilty party's seized property. Anyone in Spain could accuse conversos of faking their conversion, which would result in their arrest and trial before the Spanish Inquisition. Being brought before the Spanish Inquisition was terrifying. The accused were tortured to get confessions. Since most anyone can be made to confess to just about anything under torture, most conversos were found guilty. And the more the Spanish Inquisition found guilty parties, the more the trials reinforced the myth that conversos were secretly Jewish. Conversos who were found guilty were either imprisoned for life or burned alive in public spectacles, what came to be known as auto da fe, or acts of faith. These public spectacles were meant to reinforce myths about Jews, conversos, and heretics, and to strike fear into the hearts of Jews, conversos, and Spaniards alike. The work of the Spanish Inquisition was not limited to Spain. It was exported to Spain's colonial possessions in the New World, or New Spain as it was called. Like the Jews of Spain, the Native Americans of New Spain fell prey to the cruelties of the Spanish Inquisition. In both areas of the world, the Spanish state systematically wiped out two cultural groups for the greater honor and glory of their God. While the Inquisition was carrying out its activities, Ferdinand and Isabella decided to expel the Jews from the Spanish Crown lands in 1492. The Spanish Crown lands consisted of the newly created country of Spain, southern Italy, including the island of Sicily, and New Spain. The Dominicans and Franciscans played a central role in convincing Ferdinand and Isabella that the expulsion of the Jews was the will of their God. Under the order of expulsion, Jews were given 4 months' time to get their affairs in order and to depart. They were prevented from taking any gold or silver with them. Any Jews found in the kingdom after July 1492 would be put to death. And the order of expulsion made it illegal for Spanish Jews or their descendants to return to the Spanish Crown lands. Conversos continued to be persecuted after the expulsion of Jews. Catholics in the Spanish Crown lands engaged in public commemorations of the perfidy of Jews for centuries to come, even to the present day, such as in the annual so-called Running of the Jews on Good Friday in the Sicilian town of San Fratello, as seen here in a recent photograph that can easily be found on the web. Only in 2015 did the Spanish legislature vote to restore the right of return to the descendants of Spanish Jews expelled in 1492. It took over 500 years. Unfortunately, the Spanish expulsion of Jews was not unique in Europe. The French monarchy had already expelled French communities 3 times before the Spaniards did. The English monarchy expelled Jews living in England in 1290. German Jews were expelled from several Germanic states in 1348 and again in 1498, in imitation of the Spanish monarchy. The Hungarian monarchy expelled Jews living in Hungary in 1349 and again in 1360. The Lithuanian monarchy in Eastern Europe expelled Jews from their kingdom in 1445 and again in 1495, also imitating the Spanish monarchy. The Portuguese crown expelled Jews living in Portugal in 1496, another case of a monarchy imitating the Spanish crown. In addition to putting an end to the millennial presence on the Iberian Peninsula, the Spanish and Portuguese expulsion had other major consequences. The expulsion brought short-term financial ruin on Spain and Portugal. The downturn in the economy was a direct consequence of expelling some of the most educated and most productive people in the two kingdoms. Economic recovery of the two kingdoms came unexpectedly. First, Portugal had recently converted to a slave economy with the production of sugar, one of the most expensive commodities up to the 15th century. Chattel slavery made the Portuguese fabulously wealthy. The Spaniards imported chattel slavery to their own colonial holdings in the New World, and the country also became wealthy from the murder and exploitation of black Africans. Second, the accidental discovery of the Americas gave Spain the largest colonial holdings in North and South America and the Caribbean, and Portugal control of the area that is Brazil today. The cultivation of cash crops and the vast natural resources in South America were key to the country's economic recovery in the 16th century. The Native American genocide caused by diseases carried by Spaniards and Portuguese and state policies aimed at wiping out the Native American population ensured the success of Spain and Portugal's American colonies. The Spanish and Portuguese history of anti-Semitism had another effect. State-sponsored anti-Semitism in Spain and Portugal provided the logic the two countries needed to justify their enslavement of black Africans and their eradication of Native American civilizations. Skin color served the same function that Jewish blood had as a permanent marker of difference. And the genocidal actions of the Spanish and Portuguese towards the Jews during the Reconquista were repurposed for use in justifying the genocidal policies of Native Americans in the New World. This same logic was subsequently adopted by the Dutch, the French, and the British, as they too joined in the colonization of the New World. Iberian anti-Semitism provided a potent model for Europeans eager to identify the people they colonized as inherently inferior, and you may recognize it today as very much in use in the United States. Additionally, the Spanish and Portuguese expulsions led to the cultural genocide of Sephardic Judaism. Sephardic is the term for Spanish and Portuguese Jews and their descendants. Owing to the efforts of the Spaniards and Portuguese to wipe out Sephardic civilization and culture, today Sephardic Jews make up less than 20% of the Jewish population worldwide. Their language, Ladino, a Romance or Latin-based language, is virtually a dead language. Only a handful of Sephardic books from pre-1492 Spain and Portugal still exist, and Sephardic culture is relegated to museums and academic conferences. The road to exile for Sephardic Jews was difficult, dangerous, and costly. Many Jews expelled from Western Europe moved to Muslim areas of the Eastern Mediterranean, where they could practice their religion as members of a tolerated minority. Others moved to the few kingdoms that still welcome Jews, most notably in the Netherlands, a special case and one of great historical importance, where Jewish toleration first emerged among Christians a century after Spanish and Portuguese Jews were granted asylum. Poland, where the monarchy first welcomed Jews from Western Europe until they began to marginalize and persecute them like in other countries. And the Papal States, where after having welcomed Spanish and Portuguese Jews, the papacy forced the Jews into ghettos and persecuted them until the 19th century. Let's consider now what we've learned about the history of anti-Semitism during the Middle Ages. Anti-Semitism became much more complex during the Middle Ages, as additional forms of anti-Semitism arose from growing contradictions between cultural and political practices and socioeconomic realities. The complexity of anti-Semitism was owing to the fact that new forms of anti-Semitism did not replace old ones. Rather, much like striated rock in the painted desert of Arizona was formed by the accretion of successive layers of sediment, old and new forms of anti-Semitism accreted to form the medieval anti-Semitic Weltanschauung. Let's review this process of accretion. You will recall that religious anti-Semitism emerged in the Mediterranean basin during the 4th and 5th centuries CE. From late antiquity through the early Middle Ages, this Christian form of anti-Semitism spread through Europe with the conversion of Germanic and other tribes to Catholicism and with the creation of early medieval kingdoms. During this transitional period, Catholic elites lost the vast knowledge known to the ancient world or never acquired it. Thus, most of the medical, scientific, and cultural knowledge of the Greeks and Romans was lost to Europeans. This is why some historians still use the term the Dark Ages to refer to the first part of the Middle Ages. Muslim kingdoms, by contrast, were the most advanced societies in the West, thanks to Jewish and Muslim advancements of classical knowledge and from their continued contacts with the cultures of India and China. From the 8th to the 10th century, most of the Jewish population could be found under Muslim rule as a tolerated minority. Muslims taxed the property of the dhimmi, making farming less profitable for them. Jews, who had been mainly engaged in agriculture prior to the Muslim conquest, now shifted to urban areas where they engaged in artisanal work, while Jewish intellectual elite excelled in medicine, the sciences, and the arts. Beginning in the 9th century, Catholic leaders in Europe enticed Jews to settle in their kingdoms so they could use Jewish knowledge and expertise to foster the growth of European civilization. Catholic leaders like Bishop Rudiger of Speyer granted special charters to Jews that made allowances for the Jews to live in their kingdoms, despite the taboo against Jews living in Catholic society. The next form of anti-Semitism that emerged in Europe was a socio-economic form. It accreted to the pre-existing Catholic anti-Semitism found in Europe. This socio-economic form of anti-Semitism developed in Europe in the 9th century with the charters for the Jews. As more and more Jewish artisans, merchants, doctors, and others settled in Europe at the invitation of Catholic rulers, the permanent presence of Jews, mainly in Catholic cities, provoked fears that Jewish artisans and merchants stole business and wealth from Catholics. The threat, according to this socioeconomic form of early medieval anti-Semitism, was limited in scope. Jews constituted a threat in the medieval cities where they lived and worked, and they were really only a threat to those merchants and artisans who had to compete with them for their livelihood. These sentiments caused friction between the political religious leaders who had invited Jews to live in Europe on the one hand, and most members of the clergy, other members of the elites, and the subordinate classes on the other. Next, another form of anti-Semitism emerged in Catholic Europe, a cultural form of anti-Semitism. Since other cultural forms developed, we will call this one the first cultural form of medieval anti-Semitism. It originated in the 12th and 13th centuries. As the Jewish presence in Europe continued to grow, a series of myths about Jews began to make the rounds in Europe. These narratives spread lies about Jews. Some of these myths, like the desecration of the host and the so-called slanderous Talmud, reinforced the religious anti-Semitism that dated back to the 4th and 5th centuries. Others, like the myths of William of Norwich, the Jews of Blois, Little Hugh, and the so-called blood libel, introduced a new element into European thinking about Jews. They made Jewish men out to be a threat to European patriarchy because Jewish men supposedly preyed on Catholic boys. They played on Catholic worries about the continuation of the male line of descent. This first form of cultural anti-Semitism also posed Jews as a local threat. The threat was situated specifically in dangerous spaces like cities and other areas outside the confines of rural societies, in forests and river crossings. The myths presented the threat of Jewish men as random. For instance, the myth of William of Norwich, which singled out rabbis specifically, recounted that they supposedly met annually in El-Andalus to select a city somewhere in Catholic Europe for the ritual murder of a Catholic boy. This element was particularly pernicious because one could hold that Jewish men were, in general, a threat to Catholic families, and also believe that individual Jews, perhaps one's neighbors, who someone might know and perhaps like, were not. That is, until they revealed themselves as a threat. A second cultural form of anti-Semitism emerged about the same time as the growing popularity in Europe of medieval myths about Jews. This second cultural form emerged from the dynamics created by Catholic attacks on Muslim states in the Holy Land. In particular, the first 3 Crusades were the most significant in this regard. During the First Crusade, a ragtag army of popular forces massacred Jews and Christian Orthodox in Europe. Overlapping this unofficial and failed attempt to capture Jerusalem, an organized army under the leadership of the leading European monarchs conquered much of the Holy Land, including the city of Jerusalem. Thereupon, European Catholics created a series of Catholic Crusader states in what had been Muslim areas. The Second Crusade was precipitated when the Muslims unified to undo the Catholic conquest in what we call today the Middle East, and succeeded in recapturing a Crusader state. The Third Crusade was formed in a failed attempt to reconquer the Holy Land and recapture the Crusader states, including the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which had fallen to the Muslims in 1187. In the medieval anti-Semitic Weltanschauung, colored by the accretion of a second cultural form of anti-Semitism, Jews became the allies of the Muslims in what Catholics called a clash of civilizations with Islam. The eventual decline and fall of the Crusader kingdoms implicitly made Jews out to be traitors. The massacres of Jews in Europe by irregular popular troops and the massacre of Jews in Jerusalem by regular elite troops were justified by the Jews' supposed betrayal and by recalling the myth of the fall of Jerusalem in 614 and the supposed Jewish massacre of Christians there. The most extreme form of anti-Semitism up to this point emerged in Europe during the 14th century. It was produced by the specific conditions created by the cataclysmic pandemic of the Black Death in Europe. The Jewish threat became universal and constant. The danger was no longer limited to random individual Jewish men. All Jews, men, women, and children, were a constant threat to Catholics that reflected the nature of the Black Death. Moreover, the threat was no longer localized. It could be found everywhere in Europe now that the Black Death had become the latest and deadliest weapon in the Jewish arsenal. The recurrence of the plague for the next 300 years ensured that this most extreme form of anti-Semitism would remain constantly present in the European imagination and shape the European anti-Semitic worldview. A sixth form of anti-Semitism formed at the close of the Middle Ages. It tied together socioeconomics, culture, and politics. It emerged on the Iberian Peninsula during the Reconquista and reflected the particular conditions located there. It directly shaped Spanish and Portuguese society, and through them it directly affected Spanish and Portuguese colonial possessions in North and South America, Africa, and Asia. It indirectly affected the rest of Europe and their colonial possessions throughout the world when other monarchs and societies adapted the Spanish and Portuguese anti-Semitic worldview to their own socioeconomic, cultural, and political realities. It was different from other forms of anti-Semitism in four principal ways. It created an indelible marker of difference for Jews in how it based Jewishness on an imagined Jewish blood that was supposedly different from equally imaginary Spanish and Portuguese blood. This use of blood made it the first instance of anti-Semitism that sought justification outside the bounds of religion. Proponents even argued that baptism had no impact on one's blood. Thus, the offspring of Jewish converts to Catholicism also became suspect. The use of the term conversos demonstrated how Jewish ancestry joined Judaism as a marker of difference in Europe for the first time. Finally, Jews became a direct political threat in Europe. Arguably, no other example outside the Iberian Peninsula demonstrated this fourth aspect more than the case of Rodrigo Lopez. Lopez was a Portuguese converso who immigrated to England and eventually became the chief physician to Queen Elizabeth I. Jealousy of his influence at the court of Elizabeth I stirred up hatred against him. His enemies used his identity as a converso against him and eventually got him condemned to death for supposedly trying to poison the Queen. The Queen had him executed in 1594 despite her suspicion of his innocence. In addition to demonstrating how Jews and those of Jewish descent were viewed as a political threat, this incident is evidence of how popular thinking about Jews could affect the actions of European elites. Let's take a look at a visual representation that illustrates what I mean by the accretions of anti-Semitism in medieval Europe. Religious anti-Semitism served as the base of the medieval anti-Semitic worldview. It was the oldest form and dated back to the 4th and 5th centuries. From the 9th century onward, we find the addition of a socioeconomic form of anti-Semitism as a reaction to permanent Jewish settlements in Europe. Beginning around the 12th and 13th centuries, derogatory myths about Jews introduced a first cultural form. A second cultural form accreted to the others, beginning with the Crusades. It introduced an exterminationist tone to European anti-Semitism. However, a fully exterminationist form of anti-Semitism did not emerge in Europe until the pandemic of the Black Death. The last form of anti-Semitism emerged at the close of the Middle Ages. It began in Spain and Portugal and spread to the Spanish and Portuguese colonies. It also spread to other areas of Europe and to the other European colonies around the world. This form of anti-Semitism was socioeconomic, cultural, and political. The accretion of anti-Semitism from the 4th century to the 15th century placed Jews and their descendants under an increasing cloud of suspicion in Europe and around the world. Let's consider some additional conclusions about the history of anti-Semitism during the Middle Ages. The advantages European leaders offered to Jews to settle in Europe over the Middle Ages led to a sizable shift in the proportion of Jews from the 8th century to the 14th from Muslim territories to Catholic Europe. Despite monarchs' eagerness to exploit Jews by granting them the privilege to live and work in their kingdoms during the Middle Ages, most Europeans never accepted them. Because of the contrasting views between monarchs and the rest of the population, European Jews found themselves in an ambiguous situation and in a liminal space on the margins of Catholic society. As more and more monarchs in Western Europe began rethinking their benevolent policy towards Jews, they revoked privileges and expelled Jews. Thus Jews began migrating from Western Europe to Eastern Europe, shifting the population again, this time of Jews eastward to Poland and Russia. Jewish security in medieval Europe depended on a monarch's benevolence and a monarch's willingness to protect Jews from the rest of the Catholic population. A weak monarchy, or even a momentary lapse of royal authority, put Jews at risk of death, forced conversion, and exile. Roman Catholicism had an important role in how anti-Semitism played out in medieval Europe. Some clerical leaders were benevolent towards Jews, others were not. As we shall see in the subsequent period of the 16th century Reformation, Catholic and Protestant religious authorities increasingly took a strong position against Judaism and facilitated the spread of anti-Semitism even more. This trend would continue until the mid-20th century. And finally, most Christian leaders had opposed the forced conversion of Jews as contrary to divine law. However, over the second half of the Middle Ages, forced conversions increasingly became an acceptable punishment for Jews everywhere in Europe. Life for Jews and their descendants, whether they converted or not, was increasingly precarious.